I am Susan Monahan, and welcome. This is my friend, Pei-lin Yu. And we are here to talk about the Lunar New Year in Walla Walla. People who know me well realize that I am very intrigued and interested and sometimes obsessed with the history of our Chinese culture in Walla Walla. It's very, very important to me. And in the years that I have left, my goal is to pull together every scrap of information that I can about these fascinating people and write it up and leave it as a legacy. They are a worthy and wonderful group of people, and we, at this point, do not know enough about them. Happily, today I will not share with you everything that I have discovered. I'm going to focus on the Lunar New Year with my friend Pei-lin. What's really special about tonight is that there's a bonus feature. And the bonus feature of the talk is Pei-lin discussing the history of the dragon who used to dance in Walla Walla a long time ago. So I will do the first part and then hand it over to Pei-lin. How am I doing with the mic so far? I sound kind of okay, but let me know. Well, why did we even have Chinese people in Walla Walla? It's because of Idaho. If they had not discovered gold in Idaho in 1861, we would have had a different history. But they did. And the prospectors, many of which were Chinese, passed through Walla Walla, which is where they got their supplies. In fact, there was a gentleman named Hen Lee who was both a laundryman and owned a mercantile in actually that log cabin that you see on the screen, which was really originally owned by Dorsey Baker, the railroad guy. So Dorsey Baker was Hen Lee's landlord. And he had his mercantile and his laundry in this building very early on, 1860s. The gentleman that you see there with the equipment, that's the sort of thing that a person needs for placer mining. So he is definitely on his way to the Idaho gold fields. Placer mining was a specialty. Of course, you're washing the rocks and the gold is settling, and that's essentially what placer mining is. There were towns that sprang up during the 1860s in Idaho that were out of nowhere. And some of which we've never even heard of, like Florence, for instance, Orofino, Pierce City, Placerville, and Idaho City. Orofino and Pierce City were especially important and of interest to the Walla Walla newspaper that was forever covering whatever was happening up there. And a lot of the Chinese people who were prospecting in Pierce City and in Orofino ended up back in Walla Walla after the gold rush was over. There are a few artifacts that remain in both Orofino and Pierce City that remind us how important the Chinese people were when they were there and how many of them there were. So if you visit this very small collection in the Orofino Museum, you will see the ginger jars and the abacus and various tools, many of which probably were supplied by Hen Lee right here in Walla Walla. Same with the things that are available at the Pierce City Library, which is a very small collection, but very special, of artifacts from the days when Chinese prospectors were so important there. Well, the gold ran out. And a lot of the Chinese that were prospecting in those mountain towns, gold towns, came back to Walla Walla. They knew this place. They were familiar. They had passed through it on their way. This is just a sampling of an 1887 census. Those are all Chinese names, but like I said, this is just a sample. There were many more. What did they do when they came back? Wash house, cook, gardener, wash house, cook. You can see they had different professions, and they're not all represented there. They came back, they settled, and they worked. Some worked on railroads. There was still section work, very, very important, especially with Dorsey Baker's Railroad from like 1872 to 1875, and then branch lines after that. Some ran laundries. In 1881, there were 9 Chinese laundries in Walla Walla, if you can imagine. And we see on Main Street there, we see the Stein House, which is now the Dakers Hotel, to get you oriented. And way down the street, kind of wedged in there, is Kim Lee's Laundry. So he even had one on Main Street. Many worked as domestics. Mr. Toy was the cook at Billings Hall, and Hoy, the servant at for the Penrose family, as you can see, holding on to the children, very much a family member. Hui, very important to the Baumeister family. Lots of merchants, not just dealing in goods for the Chinese population, but also for the white population of the community. Charles Tung, an important merchant, and because he had been born, it is said, in the United States, he was also fluent in English and definitely often an interpreter. This is one of my favorite photos ever. This is from Whitman College Archives. This is a group of businessmen from Walla Walla. It is not dated, but these are all prominent businessmen, including the gentleman in the very middle. He was called Shoe Fly. His parents did not name him Shoe Fly. They named him Gi Shu Li, but it was irresistible to the white population. They decided to call him Shoe Fly. He was actually one of the sons of Hen Li, who we saw way back there in the cabin. Hen Li had 3 sons who all became very, very prosperous and very, very important in the community, and Shoe Fly was one of them. There were craftsmen. You could get your fainting couch upholstered by a Chinese upholsterer. And lots of Chinese medicine. And once again, these gentlemen were not just frequented by our white citizens, by our Chinese citizens. There were many, many white citizens who swore by them also. Chinese truck gardeners, incredibly important, supplied the whole community with produce. Wonderful produce, extensive truck gardens all around town. At first, of course, it was the pole balanced on my shoulders with the baskets. Then a horse-drawn wagon, and eventually even mechanized pickup trucks. These are all photos from Walla Walla of our truck gardening residents. Many Chinese restaurants, of course, and this actually continued, of course, way into the 20th century. Charlie Ong, in his noodle parlor, another son of Hen Li. So, how were our Chinese residents, who provided so many services and made such significant economic contributions to our community, how were they treated? You know what I'm going to say, don't you? Unfortunately, not well. Very disrespectful. These pejorative terms were so common that nobody would flinch when you read them or said them. These were the things that we called people who we lived amongst. Why do I show you these very distasteful and unpleasant names? I think we need to acknowledge that that's what we did, and to confront that, to vow never to do it again, to regret, and to remember that how hurtful names can be for people who are perhaps different than we are. In 1882, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act, which really added to any anti-Chinese sentiment that was already there, just exacerbated the situation. You can see Uncle Sam kicking out Chinese folks. There were businesses in town that prided themselves on the fact that they did not hire Chinese, such as a City Hotel, which had white cooks, we know what that means, and the Star Saloon that was very specific, no Chinamen employed. Not everybody was opposed to Chinese labor. The headline says, West needs Chinese labor. Who said? Well, William Ritz was the actually nephew and inherited Philip Ritz's huge orchards. And he maintained that at least 100 Chinese laborers were needed in Walla Walla, which may sound familiar, that immigrant labor is often very, very beneficial to those of us who grow things. But despite all that anti-Chinese sentiment, there were two instances in which Walla Walla was very, very drawn to the Chinese community, fascinated. One was funerals, Chinese funerals. It was the procession to the cemetery that they found so intriguing and entertaining. And sure enough, right in the middle there, we see our friend Shoefly. The other instance in which the townsfolk were so fascinated by the Chinese community was Lunar New Year and the Lunar New Year celebrations. Very early coverage of this, 1866, we were barely a town. And there was newspaper coverage which said that, well, you know, the Celestials were dressed in their most aristocratic garb, and they were parading Main Street. And you ask yourself, well, how many? How many could there have been to make a parade? Well, if in 1870, just a few years later, there was a population of 50, that's a pretty good parade. And in 1878, this is the first instance we see of the traditional Chinese generosity during the Lunar New Year, not just with each other, but with townspeople. This gentleman had a laundry. He invited people in. He had a table spread with Chinese delicacies and invited everybody to partake. And at that time, just a few years later, Walla Walla had a total population of about 9,000. So think about it. If it was 600 to 1,000 Chinese, that's a significant number. Now you probably are asking, 600 to 1,000? That's quite the range. Well, counting our Chinese residents was a big challenge. It was not an accurate process. It was not consistently done. And anytime you see a census report or a population report of our Chinese citizens, grain of salt, all right, because you don't know how accurate it's going to be. Now, the celebrations decreased as the years passed. Certainly that Exclusion Act of 1882 is going to affect the number of people who can immigrate, because unless you were a merchant or a student, you weren't coming in. So it really made a difference in terms of the number of Chinese who could immigrate here. Plus, one had to carry around a certificate. You see Mr. Wong Su's certificate there from 1892. You see all the folds in it? Because at all times, he had to have that document on his person or be in jeopardy of being arrested and jailed and deported. So we were not making it easy for our Chinese residents. The Statesman reported there were 1,000 Chinese in Walla Walla in 1880, and we're going to see that that number is going to be affected. 1900, the census report said 403. Can you see how it's reducing? In 1904, there were all of a sudden 500, but once again, like I said, we never know. And the article that year said firecrackers were much in evidence along Alder Street, where headquarters are maintained. They talk about a Joss house. A Joss house is not necessarily ceremonial, but it can be. But it's more of a gathering place for the Chinese community. And the article mentions it was gone. And why was it gone? And why were so many of the Chinese gardens gone right around this date? They did celebrate, it says. However, they mentioned that things were really changing. We see a plat map. Responsible for that plat map is John Langdon and Mary Green, who that year were getting rid of a lot of Chinese truck gardens and developing the Greens Park addition, which probably sounds familiar to us. If you live, for instance, on Alvarado Terrace, your home is very likely built on what was formerly a Chinese truck garden. I think this is amusing. In 1909, in the article, it was reported that, unbelievable as it may seem, none of the menus included chop suey. And the leading caterers of Rose Street, that means the Chinese who knew what they were talking about, calmly declare that no Chinaman ever partakes of that dish. And it does look, I think, pretty unappetizing. Definitely developed for American tastes and lasted for a long, long time. In 1910, my very favorite article, because planted in this article, even though it's just covering the Lunar New Year in 1910, there's loads of wonderful information. White residents are wearing cotton in their ears, the firecrackers, and keeping their eyes open for a new Tong War. There is something about Tong Wars that was so sensational that white residents almost regretted the fact that there was not much more violence and friction amongst the various organizations. A Tong is an organization sometimes around familial ties. Normally, it was just an organization that was supposed to be helpful and supportive to the Chinese residents. But especially in San Francisco, they took on a kind of a gang-like aspect, and there were indeed Tong Wars and violence and murders. Why the people in Walla Walla regretted the fact that we were not having that happen here, I do not know. But they were pretty sure it was imminent. But my very favorite part of this article is, the small-footed ladies will make annual calls on friends. What does that tell us? That is just full of great information. First of all, we're having families. We have husbands and wives, which is really an improvement over the past when it was just lists and lists and lists and lists of single men on their own, earning wages, sending money back to China, not allowed to bring their families, lonely, lonely lives. So we see here that there are indeed husbands and wives. Now, who are these ladies? Well, they are undoubtedly the wives of merchants. They are wealthy enough to bind their feet. It says small-footed ladies because it is talking about women who observe the practice very early on of binding their feet. This is something that went on in China for hundreds and hundreds of years, and even though we all find it pretty horrifying, it was still going on even in the 20th century. These small-footed ladies would make little mincing steps on these visits, or they would have to be carried. This is an undated photo of a Walla Walla family. I would give anything to know who these people are. I desperately want it to be Hen Lee. I cannot prove it. Also, I am seeing his wife and his daughter, neither of whom have their feet showing, so we do not know, but I think it is very likely that their feet were bound. In 1912, the Chinese decided, well, you know, everybody else in town seems to be celebrating on January 1st. That's their New Year. That's the Caucasian custom. And Charles Tung reported that, you know, there were a lot of Chinese who were going that route. However, that there were still many of them who stuck to their traditional end of January, early February Lunar New Year dates. Eldon Heath, wonderful guy. As a little boy, he was absolutely fascinated by his Chinese residents and followed them around, made notes, wrote a couple of pages of wonderful memoirs about his memories of the Chinese in his community. And he did mention that on the Chinese New Year, the alley between Rose and 5th would be literally covered with spent firecrackers. Lee Roberts, you may have heard of Lee Roberts, another pioneer. He mentioned the fact again, once again, that the Chinese were great on gift giving. A small, solid, white frosted cake, a Chinese lily bulb, and a bag of Chinese candy. In 1920, a tragic event where the Walla Walla citizens' fascination with funerals and their fascination with the Lunar New Year, unfortunately, were juxtaposed. 1920, preparation for the Lunar New Year, there were several people in a Chinese social club, not the Chinese building. This was more north on 5th. They were holding firecrackers in anticipation of parading. Somebody inadvertently lit those firecrackers inside. There was a horrible explosion, people burned to death instantly, noxious gases, smoke, just overall a terrible situation. These accounts are all actually from newspapers way outside of Walla Walla. So this was something that was covered all over, even nationally all over, because it was so horrible. When it got worse, 11 Chinese residents died, and because it was publicized so much, unfortunately there was a segment of Walla Walla's population that were ghoulishly drawn to the rituals at the cemetery, disrupted the rituals, created a real problem, noisy, loud, disrespectful, and even worse, stole a lot of the offerings that were left on the graves. Gladly, I can say that the city responded, definitely regretting the behavior of some of its citizens. Robbing of Chinese graves is deplored. Express regret to Chinese. We're seeing a big change, I think, from the attitude in the late 1800s and this time in the 1900s. You would think you would never recover from an event like that, but at least 2 years later, we have coverage once again of a pretty festive Chinese New Year with lilies, brown nuts, candy, carrots, and turnips, which you might not think, 2 favorite patrons. Apparently, the truck gardeners would drive through town and offer little children free turnips and carrots as a treat for Lunar New Year. Also, a real tradition of going back to China for our Chinese folks at that time to visit their homeland, which meant, of course, that I needed to carry my documentation for fear that I might not be able to get back in. By 1937, you see where we're going with this, 160 Chinese, and for the first time in memory of older Chinese, there will be no firecrackers. 1940, 74 Chinese, as reported by the newspaper. And the 1940 census does indeed say 74 Chinese. This is just, I'm afraid, kind of typical. In the margin of the census report, the reporter says, and you can see it written there on the side in longhand, you know, these people all live in one big building. It is impossible to find out about living quarters. And that's the disclaimer for, I might not have done this very well. Once again in 1950, the headline was Chinese Are Counted. This time it was a newspaper article, and Charlie Hong, another Hen Lee son, was the interpreter, so it was probably done more accurately. It was a woman, and she mentioned in the article that there were 30 Chinese counted in the Chinese building. that she was there herself with the help, thank goodness, of Mr. Ong. But she got kind of distracted by, well, the fact that, sometimes their names are Lee Hen and sometimes they're Hen Lee, and I get confused. Plus, she got distracted by a charming little girl, she said, in a red dress. 1953, fanfare of former years was missing. They said more than 100, but I wonder if that wasn't a generous count. 57, a group of elderly Chinese residents quietly observed, in sharp contrast to earlier years. And in 1962, to make matters worse, the Pacific Enterprise Building, where so many Chinese had lived and had businesses, was torn down. And it ripped the heart out of the Chinese community. Would it surprise you to know, maybe not that Dayton had a Chinese population, but that they actually had a Chinatown? I was amazed. A man named Fred Norris, who lived in Dayton, reported for the UB, and this is his article from 1970, where he describes Chinatown in Dayton as being in the 100 block of East Main, where there's all kinds of decorations, lanterns and streamers and posters. And even more special, he takes a photo of gifts given by the Chinese to the white residents. I'd give anything to know where those beautiful things are. A teapot, a whiskey jug, a crockery jar for candied fruits and nuts. If you find out, let me know, because I would really love to hear it. 1969, 60 Chinese. Year of Rooster enters scene quietly. In years past, firecrackers exploded, and there were gifts wrapped in red paper. 1970, two things. There's a special at the grocery store on chop suey mix. And it's only 49 cents. Happily, we have Sue Huey, who is actually still in our community, lovely person, who was invited to the YWCA to cook up authentic Chinese dishes, which she did, and she included recipes. 1974, Mr. and Mrs. James Hoy, who owned at that time the Modern Restaurant. Each family has their own celebration now, since there is no Chinatown anymore. And what about those family situations and traditions? Well, Sue Huey, who I just mentioned, this is a picture of her as a tiny child. She related this to me, what they did in their home at Lunar New Year. Well, after Mom lit the incense and read worship candles, we bowed to our ancestors who were seated across the table, burned paper money offerings to them for their use in the afterlife. And this is still a tradition that is maintained. This is actually a photograph of what she uses on her table. So we see the cups of wine, the candles, and the table set. She also, if you look carefully, will see a chicken who's cooked with his head on. She told me that was part of it. But she said probably the most exciting part of the evening was because of all that smoke, when the smoke alarm went off and kids ran around covering their ears and screaming. Well, what about Lunar New Year today? Has it completely faded away? No, it's still celebrated. For one thing, we got Sue Huey. She's still cooking. There she is, a fairly recent photo, making her authentic Lunar New Year dishes. And her beautiful daughters, much younger, they are grown now, and her nephews. She says it's very important to have oranges. It has something to do with the number of sons in your family. Is that familiar to you, to Pei-lin?
I don't know that.
Okay, well, she said it's important. And the red gift envelopes that go way back, into which you put money for children. And I found some. I have some. Are we going to give money to all of our people here? I only have 10, so I guess not. She also told me some traditions that you really must follow during Lunar New Year. You clean your house top to bottom before Lunar New Year, but during it, you do not sweep anything, or you will sweep away good fortune. Parents encourage children to not misbehave. Well, that should be any time. You do not cut, so as not to cut things out of your life. And you wear red clothing, or if you don't have it, your very nicest clothes. And good news about the demise of chop suey. I went to Super One just last week, and I took a picture. There is no chop suey in evidence. We do still seem to be stuck with chow mein, however. I don't know what to do about that. Well, how is Lunar New Year celebrated in Walla Walla community today? It is... Walla Walla University in the past has made a very big deal out of Lunar New Year. In fact, they even, last year, had what's called the lion dance. They're having a little trouble recruiting the people to dance, but we hope that he will be back next year. There's going to be a celebration on the 31st at Reed Ballroom on the Whitman College campus. I plan to go. And also known as tomorrow, yes. And also, once again, the Crazy Love Church is going to invites us all to come and make dumplings. My friend Patrick Henry went last year. He said it was loads of fun. That's at 2:30 at Crazy Love Church, which is also in, do I have a picture of it? Yes, it's in the Central Christian Church. They share space. So at 2:30 you can do dumpling making, and at 5:15 there is a dinner where you could bring a dish to share. Just do a little search for Crazy Love Church, Lunar New Year 2025. And please RSVP if you're going to go. Well, I promised you the dragon feature, and that's going to happen. We had an absolutely gorgeous dragon dancing in the streets of Walla Walla. And somebody here knows exactly where he came from. She told me, I didn't know, I thought it was a wonderful surprise. She's going to talk all about it now. Pei-lin.
I'll move on this side, excuse me. Can you hear me all right? I've got a different microphone on. Okay? Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll just pitch it up a little bit. Happy New Year. My Chinese is not good, but I try. My father is from Taiwan, where they speak they don't speak Cantonese. They do speak Taiwan Way and also Mandarin, but I've learned late in life, so I'm still learning a little bit about these things. So you can see this wonderful dragon. Have many of you seen this photograph before? Yeah, he's pretty awesome. You can see how big he is. The head of this dragon is truly spectacular. I had seen this photograph before in many places, and I was super curious about this dragon. How wonderful. Did he live here? You know, was he made by the people here? Where did he come from? A dragon detective. I figured it out by mistake. I was looking at photos late one evening, and I began to realize that his face was very special. Have any of you seen a Chinese dragon in a parade before? So if you've seen those dragons, take a look at him. For one thing, his head is really big. This is a wonderful picture. And if any of you can pinpoint where this alleyway is, I would be so happy. I have not been able to figure out. The building might be gone, but doesn't it look kind of familiar? It just seems like we've seen this alleyway before.
We have our theories, but we need help.
More theories are welcome. But you can see how big he is. That head is about 6 feet from top to bottom, and it looks like it would weigh a lot, doesn't it? But it had to be lightweight because people were dancing with it. You can see they're waiting to join a parade. So they're all waiting in the alley, and as soon as the parade goes by, they would just sort of go in, as we've seen with the parades nowadays, you know, if you have a really big float or something like that. And you can see how long he is. So this particular dragon, we found out later, at this time took about 100 men to dance properly. So I thought, gosh, I think I've seen this dragon before. I began to look very closely at his face, which is so unique. He's got that funky lower jaw. He's got these big tusks coming out, and the horns are very distinctive. His sort of little beard coming out under his ears is really unusual. I've seen a number of parade dragons. I've never seen one quite like this before. So I was talking with Susan, I think it was just one evening, I emailed her and said, by golly, I think I know where this dragon comes from, because we had met a few months before. So I just had one of those little things where it's like, oh, that's a familiar face. Okay, next slide, please. So the fact is that Wulong is still here. So a lot of times when you see these photographs of bygone times and you think there's no way that these dragons or these objects or, you know, these kinds of things are still here. You see the bygone pictures of Chinatown, it's all vanished. The dragon is still here, and he lives in Marysville, California. So that is his original home. He is an amazing dragon. I wanted to sort of point out, this is the entryway to a temple in Marysville, California. It's quite old. I think the temple dates to the 1860s or maybe a little bit earlier. It's called Bokai Temple, and it's named after a god of water. It's right along the Yuba River there. And every year, the people of Marysville have a wonderful celebration called the Bokai Festival. So if any of you are interested in going to see one of the last really good Chinese festivals in this country, Marysville, the Bokai Festival, so it's B-O-K-K-A-I, and we'll have that later in the slide. They have a dancing dragon, they have many lion dancers, they have traditional foods, and the rituals are all being held in the temple. If you have good manners and bring a little bit of cash with you, you can go into the temple and they'll tell you what to do. They'll tell you how to buy the joss sticks, how to do the proper bye-bye, the worship, and then how to move about the temple and then come out again. And they also have something called the Bomb Festival, which is absolutely amazing. It's this giant sort of bomb-shaped firework that people toss in the air. It explodes and these little rings come out, and whichever boy gets a special ring is going to get a lot of money and a great girlfriend and maybe get married that year. So the boys just, you know, used to beat each other up. And I think they used to do Bomb Festival here in Walla Walla, but
I've seen it.
Nowadays...
I've seen it in newspapers.
Oh, wonderful. So Bomb Festival was in most of the Chinatowns in the United States, a southern Chinese tradition, and I believe that Marysville has the last Bomb Festival. I was privileged to see it last year. So, how do we prove that their dragon, which sure looks familiar, is this very same dragon who danced down Main Street in Walla Walla? This is where Susan's amazing expertise in searching for newspaper articles comes into play. Because I was like, Susan, I think this is a dragon, but I know. And she goes, by golly. And she went right in and started doing some research. So the Up to the Times magazine, is so great, reports for the 4th of July that there was a Chinese celebration for the parade in which they had a dragon dance down the street, which is just super interesting. I want to point out 1912 was a very interesting time in China. Does anyone know what happened in 1911 in China? Have you seen the film The Last Emperor? 1911 was when the imperial government stopped. So for the first time in 5,000 years, there was no emperor in China. That was when the first year of the Chinese Republic. So Chinese people here were very mindful of this. And I suspect that we start seeing Chinese participation in the 4th of July as a sort of sign of patriotism to the United States and also modernity. We are not doing the Lunar New Year so much as we're doing 4th of July, or we're going to do them both. And there is also the mention of celebrating the solar New Year, because the lunar calendar is very separate from the solar calendar. So there we see in small text, Marysville, California, actually lent this dragon to Walla Walla. So nice. So what we see is, I actually ran a little bit of a calculation. You know, you can do a calculator. How much was, you know, $1912 compared to $2,025, right? You can do that. And because the people of the Chinese community of Marysville were very generous, they said, you can, just for the freight, you can borrow this dragon, okay? And so the calculation that I made was it was worth about between $16,000 and $17,000 to freight that enormous dragon by train from Marysville to Walla Walla. This was not a backwater poor Chinese community. They put their funds together, their resources together, and paid a great deal of money to bring Mulong, which means the magic dragon, here to Walla Walla. 175 feet in length, so he was long. In fact, I believe he was a little bit longer when he was first made. But you know, they get a little bit of wear and tear and you have to repair them, and then they get a little shorter, right? But you can see he is made of fabric, bamboo, paper mache, and many jewels. I would have loved to see him in his glory in full color. Now, here is how I recognized him. In the Bukkai Temple, they have a small museum, and there his head is lovingly restored. It's kind of a dark photo. He's got beautiful tones of gold, green, red. He's got tons of jewels on there. He's got festive ribbons coming off of his horns. And he's just absolutely stunning. And peacock feathers. He's just the real thing. And I'm telling you, he's about, you know, this tall. So this was another thing that was fascinating. I think that was in one of the newspaper articles.
I think it might have been in the Up to the Top, in the
Up to the Times. So they were reporting in this magazine article about the fact that there was only one gentleman in the Chinese community who knew how to dance this dragon. It takes some skill. You can't just put it on and run through the streets. There are special movements. The head has to have special movements, and the body has to follow the head in a harmonious manner and sort of flow down the street. Also, this dragon, I think you can kind of see the gentleman right in front of him is carrying a staff with a flaming pearl. The flaming pearl represents wisdom, and a person runs in front of the dragon, and the dragon is pursuing the flaming pearl. And you'll see that a lot in traditional art and depictions.
I can't see it in that photo, but you showed me another photo where you can see it.
Yeah, I think we'll see it too if we have the
videos.
videos.
And it's a pearl.
Yep, it's a pearl on fire. Okay, so this is the year that our Chinese community of Walla Walla asked the community of Marysville to borrow the dragon. So 403 Chinese, if it took 100 men to dance him, that's 1 in 4 people in the community were involved in dancing this dragon. Pretty amazing. And then, yeah, so it's really interesting. So 1900, 1912, this dragon actually had come here before. The Marysville people were very generous because Mulong was special, and they lent him to us several times, which is really wonderful. So again, we were able to pass the hat. I'm saying the Walla Walla Chinese community was able to get enough money to put him on a train a couple of times to come over here.
Well, and because it was a 4th of July celebration, I would assume the city made some contributions too, because it was adding to their festivities.
I would imagine. I hope so. I hope that's right. All right, and so here we go with the Marysville paper reports that their community had loaded up the dragon for shipment to Walla Walla, which is very groovy. I want to mention too, I don't think I did, that this dragon was not made in Marysville. These dragons took teams in workshops many months to create. They were very specialized art forms, and there was a special area in Guangdong province along the Pearl River Delta, near where the Pearl River goes out into the Pacific Ocean, where there was a series of dragon making workshops. This was a really famous one, and there is a sibling to Mulong in Bendigo in Australia. There's another large dragon, and that's the largest one. He's more than 300 feet long, and he is still there. You can go and visit him in the museum, and he is immense. Okay. And there we go. So this is something I wanted to sort of bring up too, which is this wonderful dragon. They call him a serpent or a big fish. I'm not sure where they do that. He was loaned out just for the cost of shipping. I'm presuming that the people of Marysville knew how to repair him, because he'd come back after having been danced, probably had a little bit of tears and maybe some jewels popped off or something like that. And so they were constantly repairing him. He had been to New York City the year before, and this intrigued me. They shipped him up to New York City from California? That's amazing, right? Let's see. It was even announced when he made it home safely, which I think is wonderful. So this Marysville dragon was really famous. So I started digging a little deeper to say, wow, where else was he dancing? New York City? Walla Walla? Okay, and where else was he dancing? Marysville was his hometown. You can see this is what Marysville actually looked like when he was in his heyday. And there he is sort of resting, getting ready. Again, you can see he's just piled up on stools here at this point. But Marysville actually revered this dragon. They not only, all these parade dragons have their own name, and they have character attributes. They have personalities. So they would tease him and get him all riled up, so he would dance better. And you can see they also gave him offerings. These photos, I believe, are from Los Angeles. So we found out he was dancing in Los Angeles, which is really cool. And this is, so far, where we've been able to figure out that Mulong was dancing. So he danced all over the country. He arrived in Marysville probably around 1880, and he stopped being mentioned in newspapers around 1931. So that dragon danced for 50 years across our country. And the first mention of him outside of Marysville is in Chicago. I actually don't know if you have a... There we go. So he danced at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1873. There are no photographs, but there is this advertisement trying to lure people in to see the wonders of the world at the Chicago World's Fair, and Mulong was part of that. A few more examples. There he is in Salt Lake, 1890s, in Rock Springs. Also, I think this is probably around the 1910s here, this photograph. Here he is in Boise. I'm so happy to see him dancing in Boise. You can see here, one of the things that you see in a traditional dragon parade is there are musicians that accompany him. There's a lot of music for him to dance to, which is really wonderful. I love actually, if you can go back one, I really like the mixture too here of sort of the traditional dress along with Western sort of business attire in this parade. I think that says a lot about, sort of the cultural boundaries that Chinese people were negotiating at that time. And in LA, that's a really nice picture of him dancing in the sunlight. More Los Angeles. He went to Los Angeles probably more than any other place, aside from Marysville and Seattle. So if you start looking at the newspapers, Marysville just keeps coming up every time there's a dancing dragon in a western town, or even in a midwestern town or an eastern town. He really got around. New York City, again, expressage alone was $600, and I believe, that's 1911. Again, this is a year of great upheaval in China, and this dragon is dancing and representing even with the overturning of the imperial government. Featured in a movie, I would love to find this movie. That's maybe a research project for later. I mentioned this before. This was a busy, thriving community with a lot of people who were very proud of their heritage and were happy to dig deep in their pockets to bring him over here multiple times. I think that this was not a backwater. Marysville people were well aware of the Chinese community here in Walla Walla, and they were well respected. Yes, so 1937 was when he was sort of retired. I was actually off by a couple of years, and he kind of vanished for a while. People stopped seeing, he was not dancing anymore, he was not in the newspapers anymore, and just sort of faded away from sight. And he has been lovingly preserved in the Bok Kai Temple. I don't remember if you actually have a picture of him before. There we go. So the amazing thing was people lost track of him, and then a very large box, which had been stored in the back of the temple, was opened and revealed him in the 2010s. And people thought he had been gone forever. So they found him, his head was in one box, his body was in another box, and you can see on the left he had sort of pancaked, you know, the head is very light because it's bamboo and paper, and it just sort of sank. So two young men took 2 years or 3 years, I think it was, to restore him. They did it with some grant funds to bring him back from sort of being all beat up and smushed. So he doesn't dance anymore because he's too fragile. But if you want to go visit him, you can. And there he is. So he is really something else. And I think he's very graceful and a beautiful, beautiful dragon. I think that the fact that he danced all over this country for 50 years makes him a national treasure, right? I think he's just an absolutely amazing, amazing dragon. Okay. This is Gomlong, so this is another parade dragon, another cousin. He's a little bit more recent, but you can get up a little closer to him. You can see, though, how different his face is. He came from a different workshop. The scales are very similar. They have this sort of long, flowing, sort of watery feel to them. And he is in the schoolhouse in Marysville. So the Chinatown there is pretty well preserved, and you can actually go see apothecaries and schoolhouses and the Bok Kai Temple in this part of California. It's truly lovely. Okay, so I forget this dragon's name. This is the current Marysville dragon, and he dances every year. This is his resting posture. He's very long. There are no longer enough young Chinese people to dance him, so the Bok Kai Chinese community has talked with the local Air Force base, and they supply dancers, and so they train these young people to dance this dragon. So when he's at rest, he coils up like this with the head in the middle. So during speeches or rituals, he'll rest like this. And here we go. So you can see the festival will be coming soon, March 1st and 2nd. It's usually the first weekend in March. If you can't make it this year because it's sort of short notice, plan to go next year. It is absolutely wonderful. Oh, and there's if you could back up for a moment, there is a QR code there. I don't know if your phones can register that, but
Come
we can
up
also
afterwards.
come up afterwards, and we can maybe have the slide up again, and you can get that, so you can get the announcement if you're really curious about that. So there he is, dancing down our main street, and here he is. His cousin is in action, I think. Yeah. Might have to go to the lane.
And it's not picking up the internet, but he actually dances.
Yeah, we do have some video footage of him dancing. You can also type in the Bok Kai Festival. In YouTube, it'll show him dancing, and you can see him chasing the pearl down the street with the firecrackers going off, and it makes you think about what it would have looked like on Main Street here in Walla Walla. Okay.
Good. Thank you very much for coming. You were a delightful audience. If you have questions, come up and ask them, and get the barcode too for the Bok Kai Festival. Thank you so much. Thank you.